welcome everyone, and as said, thanks for braving the terrible weather outside and making it here. And welcome to the second day of the Literary Festival. So, many of you may know Nick already, professor at the University of Macau, but Nick has also taught in the UK and the US for a number of years, and also author of a number of books, not just on Tolkien, also Shakespeare, the Gothic, Vampire Law, Change of Seasons, Forgery, and Frankenstein as well, I believe, right? So, just a part of his oeuvre. Nick first read Lord of the Rings when he was just 13 years old, and since then got the bug and was actually the only person to teach a Tolkien dedicated course in the UK for many years, which he is now teaching in Macau. In fact, I wish I could attend one of your classes. It would be quite interesting. There are copies available upstairs. The first edition of Nick's book came out 1 year ago. It's about Tolkien and about Tolkien's influence on the 21st century. I actually didn't know Nick at the time, but I stumbled across the book in London. I think I was in Foyle's bookstore on Charing Cross Road, and it was the only copy. So I grabbed it, put it in my bag, and I didn't actually get to read it until I got back to Macau a week later and was thrown into quarantine. And that was my quarantine book. And it really, got me through a tough couple of weeks. In particular, if any of you have read it, you'll probably know this, the chapters on the unmade Lord of the Rings movies, not the ones that were made, but the ones that never were. Really, really fascinating. And then maybe Nick might touch on this today, I'm not sure. But very happy to have him here, and I'll hand over to him and give him a big Macau welcome. Nick, thank you.
Thanks very much, Timothy, for those very kind words, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And now I'm the third person to say thank you for braving the weather and the typhoon threat. So, Tolkien, it should be on the PowerPoint. If you can change the screen, please. There he is there, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And so, as Timothy said, I published this book last year. It came out in September and was launched in this very bookshop here. And last month, the second edition came out in both the US and the UK, which is an expanded edition, because the first edition came out on the day that The Rings of Power was first broadcast, so of course I couldn't say very much about it. But this new edition does have an extra section on The Rings of Power. I will be talking about The Rings of Power at the end of this afternoon, but I'm not going to give you any spoilers, because I know that not everybody's seen it. So, why did I bother to write a book about Tolkien? Well, having been reading and teaching Tolkien for many years, I began to realise there'd been a shift. And the shift was primarily that the students coming to my classes had seen the films, but were just about to get round to reading the books. A few years ago, they'd all read the books first, and we talked about the films subsequently. But there's been a shift, and I realised that there was a problem, really, in the sort of Tolkien world. There's this attitude that one should read the books first, and only then are you allowed to see the films. I thought that's just not, how things are anymore. There are people who are reading the books, sure, but there are people who are watching the films, listening to radio adaptations, now watching The Rings of Power, and then they're going to be having a very different experience. And I really wanted to reflect that and make sure that there wasn't really a hierarchy, that we're not judging people because they haven't yet read the books, but they are still enjoying the Tolkien world, the phenomenon, the multiverse, if you like, this multi-platform range of not only books, films, TV, but also things like games and art and so forth. So, this is the book that's just been published in the US, which I've not yet seen. Slightly different title, but it's basically the UK hardback. Now, I'll just say a little bit about Tolkien. Whoops, that's doing the wrong thing there. Sorry, I have to fix the PowerPoint. Tolkien published The Hobbit in 1937. And that's the cover design for it there. And lots has been written about The Hobbit, and I wanted to take a different approach and really see it as a playful sort of comic book, really. Because if you remember, it begins with Gandalf going to see Bilbo. And Bilbo says, "Good morning." And Gandalf says, good morning. And then Gandalf begins to play with the phrase good morning and say, what do you really mean by good morning? Are you wishing me good morning? Are you saying to me it's a good morning? And now you're using it to tell me to go away, that you've had enough of me. It's reminded me of a character in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It's Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty defines words in different ways. He plays with words. He says the point is to have mastery over words. It's who is to be master of language, not what words mean. And Gandalf playing with words is Tolkien alluding, I think, to this playful language games of a writer like Lewis Carroll. Of course, they were both at Oxford. Carroll had been there some sort of 75 years before. So I began to think more about this way of, we're tending to think of these books, we take them very seriously, we enjoy reading them, but maybe we should be looking at the comic side of them. So after the Humpty Dumpty Gandalf, I began thinking about the spiders of Mirkwood. If you remember, in Mirkwood Forest, there are giant spiders. There are very few, if any, giant spiders in European literature until we get to Tolkien. Arguably, there's a German short story. There's possibly a satire, classical satire. But I think that the closest analogy, this is going to surprise you, is Little Miss Muffet. Now, that's Arthur Rackham's illustration of Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet eating her curds and whey. Down came a spider and sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away. So what Tolkien's doing, he's taking things like children's rhymes, other books, nursery rhymes, playing with them, giving them new life, revitalising them, showing that they can be part of a different story, that the language games or the giant spiders can actually be developed and change. We now think of giant spiders as being an absolute sort of standard, it's a convention of horror and fantasy. But I think that Tolkien's the first to actually use them and develop them, and of course in The Lord of the Rings and in the Silmarillion they became even more significant. Now, one of the other things I wanted to point out with regard to The Hobbit, and that's Tolkien's own illustration of Bag End, where Bilbo Baggins lives, there's Bilbo there, was the amount of ambiguity there is. Everybody who reads The Hobbit thinks Bilbo is great, he's a sort of hero, he's also a victim, he goes on a sort of journey through it. But he's also very morally ambiguous. This isn't a book to teach children really how to behave. He lies, he steals, he deceives. And in fact, the daughter of a friend of mine stopped reading the book. She threw it across the room because she said it's not moral enough. Her father was an archbishop. But this sort of sense of uncertainty and this ambiguity I got very interested in. I think it's very typical of Tolkien's writing. He's not being dogmatic, he's not telling you what to think, he's being very practical at how you get out of certain circumstances, situations, and how you solve problems by the most practical means rather than through some other structures. But also notice, looking at this picture, some of the other qualities that it has. We think of Tolkien as being a sort of a medieval fantasy, but Bilbo smoking a pipe, he's got a waistcoat, he's got a clock, he's got a barometer in his hobbit hole. So he's very much an 18th century gentleman. And yet he sort of goes on a journey not just across Middle-earth, but through time. He goes back through time to the Middle Ages. And so when he meets the dwarves, he's meeting people not only from another part of Middle-earth, but he's meeting beings, creatures, a species, really, who come from a different time. Bilbo has handkerchiefs and clocks, but you can't imagine Thorin having a pocket watch, really. So The Hobbit was a critical success, and the publishers wanted to have a follow-up, and so Tolkien started writing a sequel, which became The Lord of the Rings. But it took a long time for it to become The Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings took over a decade to write, and then a few more years before it was published. The problem is that everyone wanted more hobbits. And Tolkien had been writing this vast fictional mythology, which was eventually published as a Silmarillion. Some of you may have read it. I call it the Everest of Tolkien's studies, It's a very challenging book to read. Tolkien never finished it to his satisfaction, and now there have been many different versions of it published. But this was always at the background, and he really wanted to write those stories. But The Hobbit is set in that world, and so The Lord of the Rings becomes set in that particular world. But I say he begins by wanting more hobbits. That's the thing that really entertains his readership, and they don't appear in the Silmarillion. So he starts writing The Lord of the Rings, really rewriting the first chapter of The Hobbit. The Hobbit is an unexpected party. In The Lord of the Rings, it's a long expected party. It actually lifts various sentences before the story develops. And how does the story develop? Well, the story develops through discovery. Tolkien wrote without a plan. Now, some of my students are here, and they'll know that I'm always saying, if you're going to write anything, have a plan. Make sure that you write the points out, that you know where you're going, you know what the direction of travel is. Tolkien wrote in a completely opposite way. He spent his time exploring and discovering things, trying to learn about the world, about his characters. He had no idea where the story was going. As he got into writing about the hobbits in the Shire, one of his colleagues said, how's the fiction going? He said, well, these black riders have appeared. I don't know who they are or where they're from. I'm going to have to find out. And when he did try to sketch out various plans, it just shows how much his ideas changed and developed. I think one of the most interesting examples of this, if I've got the slides, sorry, is this slides gone again? Is it coming back? No. Next one would be Older Man Willow. People think of Tolkien as a tree hugger, somebody who loves nature, who's very environmentally conscious, who's very aware of nature and the human impact on nature. But almost immediately the hobbits get stuck in the old forest and they get trapped. Two of them get trapped inside Old Man Willow. Tolkien had thought about the Ents as being evil. When he does sketch out parts of the story, he writes down Treebeard, an evil character. So the trees were going to be evil at one point. Again, they're very, very beloved characters now, and there certainly are evil trees there. There's the Huorns, for example. But Old Man Willow, I think, is an early example of that. Now, the critic Tom Shippey has pointed out that Tolkien is also probably one of the earlier writers to use animated trees. And I think it's sort of half right. Tolkien himself said he got the idea from Macbeth, but he really wanted a forest to go to war rather than just soldiers disguising themselves with branches and leaves and so forth. And there are hints in other books, but quite surprisingly, there's Arthur Rackham, who has these sort of tree elves, so these animated natural figures. But also, in 1932, Walt Disney produced the Silly Symphony of Trees and Flowers, which you can find on YouTube, which is well worth watching. It's the first Disney animation to have a full classical soundtrack. It's also the first one to have an evil character who dies, who is an evil tree. So it's about a sort of a war between the trees, the birds and the flowers, and so forth. And very well known because it actually won an award for being for the best animation. So I think these unexpected sources perhaps lie behind what Tolkien's doing, and it's really sort of a part of this, which again suggests that there's sort of an ambiguity in these books. Of course, the first ambiguity is when you open them and you get languages you've never seen before, alphabets, you get maps, and you get prefaces, and then when you think you've finished the book, you get appendices, you get more information about the chronology, you get little inserted narratives, you even get an index, and there aren't many novels in English that have maps, let alone novels with indexes. So I tend to see him as an experimental writer. He's not just experimenting finding his story, finding his narrative, he's also experimenting with the way that you tell a story and the sort of extra material that readers might like to actually enjoy. So you certainly get the maps, but you also get the same level of ambiguity that you get in The Hobbit, with things not fitting together. In The Hobbit we have clocks and barometers and tobacco, as well as medieval fighters. in Lord of the Rings, first of all, we get that fox that watches the hobbits go from the Shire. And the fox thinks, how strange to see hobbits out at this time. I wonder what they're doing. And Tolkien says, what they were doing, he never found out. And that's it. That's the only moment of a fox having a thought. But it suggests there's a whole realm of experience that we're not really being introduced to. And the most radical example of this is what I call the Marmite character, Tom Bombadil. Some people love him, some people hate him. He's cut from nearly every adaptation because he's such a frivolous, unexpected comic character. And there aren't many jokes in The Lord of the Rings. But he sort of sings and prances around. The ring has no effect on him. He teases the hobbits. He also rescues them. And he's not of the world. He's not of Middle-earth. When Frodo says, well, why don't we give the ring to Tom Bombadil to look after? And Gandalf says, well, he'd probably just lose it. Because he's not interested in things like that. So the suggestion is that although people talk about Tolkien creating Middle-earth as this self-sustained secondary world, which is very consistent and everything makes sense. No, it doesn't. The reason why it's so successful as a secondary world is because it doesn't make sense. Because our world, it doesn't make sense. We've got loads of loose ends, loads of contradictions. You don't know what other people are thinking. They're often saying different things. So it's those ambiguities, uncertainties, hesitancies that make the world real, not the fact that it all fits together perfectly like a jigsaw or like a pocket watch. So I really wanted to get that point across in the book. It's the fact that Tolkien is a very different sort of writer than he's often presented as. There might be jokes, of course. I don't know whether this really is a joke. But some people online have said, well, why don't the Company of the Ring just get the eagles and fly to Mordor and throw the ring into the cracks of doom there? Maybe that's what Gandalf suggests when he's hanging from the bridge of Khazad-dûm. And he says, fly, you fools. But that's just being frivolous, because, of course, Saruman has already commanded the skies by the time they leave Rivendell. There's lots of his spies there. And, of course, the Nazgûl get their fell beasts on which they can ride themselves. So just wanted to point out some of the ambiguities in this book. And it's a successful book when it's published. But Tolkien didn't make much money out of it, because it was only published in hardback. And so it quickly became apparent that he had to try to make more money. And one of the first things he did was to sell his manuscripts. 9 feet of manuscripts. He didn't sell them for very much. I think it was about the equivalent of about £125,000 sterling, which would be about $1.25 million Macau dollars. So that's a fraction of what they'd be worth today. He struggled with money for all of his life. And eventually, in the US, a paperback version of his book was published, which became a bestseller. But it was an illegal paperback. So he made no money out of it. And all of his fans in the US were saying, don't buy this one, wait until the official paperback comes out, and then you should buy the official paperback. And that's what then happened. Ballantine produced the official paperback. So now he was a best-selling writer in the US, and what happens? He gets profits, and then the tax man comes and presents him with a huge tax bill. And that's the reason why Tolkien sold the movie rights. He sold the film rights to pay a tax bill. So without that illegal paperback, without the tax demand, without him having to surrender those rights, we probably wouldn't have the Peter Jackson films. There had been a strange deal struck before then to sell the rights of The Hobbit, and they were sold to Gene Deitch, who produced a very idiosyncratic film, as you can see here. Very, very short. It's only about 12 minutes long. He produced it so he could keep the rights. He changes everything. The dragon's called Slag, Thorin's called Taurine, and Bilbo ends up marrying a fairy princess at the end. But it's quite characteristic in its styling. But it shows how keen Tolkien wants to get money. But those rights were then bought back, and they were sold as a package, and then sold to United Artists for a more considerable sum. Tolkien was always looking to make money. He was always giving radio talks. Now, lingophone was a set of old records on which you learnt different languages, and he appears on some of these for people to learn English. So there's sort of things like what you say at the tobacconists, because Tolkien was a keen pipe smoker, or describing what a wireless was, which is a radio for the younger members of the audience. So he appears on things like this. He also, because being a professor, he was always buying books. Blackwell's bookshop in Oxford was his favourite haunt, but he didn't have enough money to pay his bill. So he actually offered Basil Blackwell, the owner, a translation of a medieval poem that Basil Blackwell could then publish in return for paying off his bill. I don't know, Ricardo, what you think of that, whether I was to offer you a translation of a medieval poem. Basil Blackwell did accept it, but never got round to publishing the poem. But the point that I'm trying to make is he's doing it he needs the money, and sadly he only saw the real profits right at the end of his life. But earlier he had said, I'll sell the film rights for art, meaning if it's going to be very loyal, or for cash. It ended up being for cash. And one of the first groups of people interested in making a movie were the Beatles. When they went to see the Maharishi Yogi in India, took the Lord of the Rings with them. Now, Ringo didn't stay there. He went home quite early. He didn't like the food. But very weirdly, John, Paul and George each read one volume of the Lord of the Rings independently. And then they said, yes, we must make a film about this. We need somebody like Stanley Kubrick to do it. But Stanley Kubrick said it was unfilmable. And there have been various stories told about this, which I think are all quite tall tales. But they certainly did have an interest in doing it. But United Artists instead went to John Borman, who's an experimental filmmaker, best known today probably for Deliverance, which is a very it's a thriller, it's a sort of terrifying thriller about a group of American men going down a river before it's dammed up. It's a very strange film about the American backwoods. And John Borman worked with Ross Pallenberg, the script writer, on producing a one-volume version of The Lord of the Rings. The way they did it was to go to his cottage in County Wicklow in Ireland and get the book, cut all the pages out, and then stick them all over the walls and the ceilings. So they said, we wanted to feel like we were living in the book. And they produced a one-film treatment, which radically restructures the book, does away with major scenes and characters, but focuses on what Borman thought were the mythic elements. And these were to do with magic and to do with the changes of personality of the main characters. So he's coming out of the 1960s as a filmmaker. This was an adult movie, okay? At one point they wanted to have an elvish brothel in it. That got rewritten to be Frodo being seduced by Galadriel, and then the rest of the company not talking to him for several days because they were all jealous. But it does actually have a great vivacity, great urgency to it. It's a very interesting treatment. It's worth reading the whole thing. It would have been very different if Borman would have made it. It would have been an interpretation rather than an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. But Borman tried 4 years to get this film made, and sadly never got the funding. But one of the next films he did make was Excalibur, that you may be familiar with, an Arthurian romance about King Arthur and the wizard Merlin and so forth. And lots of his ideas from The Lord of the Rings went into Excalibur. The knights are all wearing fantastically shiny armour. They've got these huge medieval weapons, but everything's so big and heavy that they can't actually move. So it's as if it's a contrast between the humanity and sort of human shortcomings and the technology of the time. So Borman, having not got any further funding, the film, the United Artists approached Ralph Bakshi, another experimental filmmaker, and he did make The Lord of the Rings, which was released in the US in 1978, in the UK a year later. It's been pretty much panned for being a terrible adaptation, but I think it's been unfairly panned. And so he's experimental. One of the reasons is he mixes animation with real life action. So this is the Company of the Ring plus Gollum down there in the corner, and it does unfortunately look rather Disneyfied. But he crossed this with something called rotoscoping, which was a degraded form of real life photography. So certain of the characters, like the Nazgul, like the orcs, for example, are filmed, and then the colours are changed. The film is scraped and degraded, and this creates a particular atmosphere for the films. He only made half the film. The second part was never forthcoming. Let's say it has been generally vilified by the Tolkien community, not least because a character as frightening as a Balrog, and here's a painting of a Balrog, in Ralph Bakshi's film appears like this. It's just rather unfortunate. But then there are certain things that do get carried over. I look at the size of the Hobbit's feet. That's Merry and Pippin being defended by Boromir, who's wearing sort of hot pants. It was the style for superheroes in the 1970s. But they've got these sort of huge, bony, very sort of sparsely haired feet. But that's exactly what Peter Jackson did. Tolkien describes Hobbit feet as being thickly furred with brown, curly hair, not looking like that at all. So he takes that element directly from Bakshi. He also takes things like the length of Saruman's nails. You'll notice in the Peter Jackson films, it's quite a nice touch. Saruman's got really long nails. That comes from the Ralph Bakshi movie. But most strikingly, perhaps, iconic scenes such as the hobbits hiding underneath the tree roots when the Black Rider is trying to find them, that's taken from the Bakshi film. So that's the Jackson version. That's the Bakshi version. Can I show you the version that's in the novel? No, it doesn't appear in the novel. So that's taken straight from the film. That's Peter Jackson adapting Ralph Bakshi. And in fact, much of the structure is also radically taken from the Bakshi version. So those sorts of iconic details are important, I think. And we're beginning to see that the adaptations are following themes of experimentation, but also beginning to develop each other's ideas. Now, there is another movie, which is the Rankin Bass Return of the King, which is an animation which just dramatizes the third book, and some people think that it's trying to finish off the Ralph Bakshi film. It doesn't really do that. But the next major adaptation is by the BBC Radio, which is Brian Sibley and Michael Bakewell produced an iconic audio recording. Interestingly, they took some of the actors from the previous film, from the Ralph Bakshi film. They took Graham Cox, who played Boromir, and Peter Woodthorpe, who played Gollum. So they wanted to develop what had already been seen at the cinema. But they also had some of the top-class British actors like Michael Hordern, the Shakespearean, John Le Mesurier, well known as a comedy actor in something called Dad's Army. Also, Bill Nighy plays Sam in this version, and Ian Holm is in it as Frodo. Now, that's the reason why Ian Holm turns up in the Peter Jackson films as Bilbo. Peter Jackson is making a direct connection with that earlier radio adaptation, to the extent that when the actors were flying to New Zealand to be in Peter Jackson's films, he made sure that they all had the audio recording of the BBC version. So it's well worth listening to it if you're interested in the Peter Jackson films, because Peter Jackson is profoundly influenced by that radio adaptation. And certainly, Andy Serkis did a great version of presenting Gollum on screen. But that's based on the Gollum that's in this radio version from 1981. And that Gollum was the same actor who was in the Ralph Bakshi film of 1978. So there's a sort of continuity here, which I think it's important to be aware of. So we finally do get to the Peter Jackson films. So these are self-consciously within a particular tradition. They are also restructuring, and they're adding new scenes. So I imagine that we all love these movies, but they are retellings. They're not just loyal settings of these books. There's also much more humour in these. I said there's not many jokes in Tolkien's writings, but Gandalf's a much lighter character, played by Ian McKellen. You've got the comic characters of Merry, and particularly Pippin, to appeal to younger viewers. Gimli is a much more humorous character in this. Don't tell the elf, when he's about to get tossed into the Battle of Helm's Deep. And I couldn't get a good film still of this because it's so dark, but you've got things like the skateboarding Legolas scene, where he skateboards down the stairs, firing off arrows at a fantastic rate. Now, this offended purists at the time, but now it's become, part of the whole culture of these films, and we love seeing these. We love the director's extended cut and so forth. So this is really the moment at which people start watching the films before they read the books, if they ever then do read the books. And I think this just has to be respected. One of the things that makes Peter Jackson's films so characteristic is their material quality. Real swords, real sets, real details. The extent that Viggo Mortensen, who played Aragorn, sorry, I have to shift this again, so the PowerPoint has gone again. If you notice in the movies, you'll see his knuckles are very often rubbed and scarred from the battle scenes, but he also at one point broke his front tooth and suggested they just use super glue to stick it back in with. Peter Jackson said, no, you're going to get emergency dental work and then you can come back. There's also stories about Viggo sort of sleeping with his sword, for example. So it is at the same time, it has this material tangibility to it. But it also makes major changes, such as with the character of Arwen, completely justifiable. There aren't, for the 20th century, there aren't enough strong female characters in Middle-earth, so Arwen takes over many of the roles, and Galadriel, of course, is made much stronger as well, particularly when she's tempted by the ring. So that was Peter Jackson's blockbusting first go. Then you get the Hobbit movies, equally successful, many of the same points, but now using much more CGI. That's what Tolkien would have imagined Smaug's hoard to be like. Of course, in Peter Jackson's version, it's like an ocean of gold that if it would have ever been released into the marketplace, it would have wrecked the entire economy of Middle-earth. But he's trying to come up with stupendous scales here. And also much more humour. I mean, the trolls are humorous in Tolkien's version. Remember, it is a children's book, but they're even more comic, I think, here. And most of the good characters have comic aspects. The dwarves, particularly Dane, who's played by Billy Connolly, a comedian. But interestingly, you can draw a line that some of the evil characters... Gollum, of course, has comic aspects when you're doing the riddle game. Yes, and if Precious wins, then we eats it, which Bilbo agrees to. But characters like Azog and Bolg, who appear in the appendices to Lord of the Rings, so that's an important thing to remember, that these are taken from Tolkien's own sources, are presented as being fundamentally evil without any sense of humour about them. Also, Galadriel's more powerful in this film even than she is in Peter Jackson's earlier film. She rescues Gandalf from Dol Guldur. And this is really appealing, again, to even younger audiences. But my youngest daughter has read The Hobbit, loves all the Hobbit films, has only just graduated to watching the Lord of the Rings movies because she was frightened by them. But she didn't find The Hobbit so challenging. And so she's going to have a very different experience, an interesting experience, I think, in a sort of succession of Middle-earth adaptations that she's having a look at. Which brings us finally to The Rings of Power. First aired just over a year ago, and the second season is apparently wrapped, you were saying, Timothy, so we can expect that, I think, in the new year. Now, in a sense, this is indebted to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies. I think it tries to consciously refer through what characters say, but also through that having real weapons, real locations, and having a level of detail which creates an authentic atmosphere and sense to the production. So you don't get so much CGI in this. It's going back to the Jackson Lord of the Rings and then to Tolkien's own book. There's not much humour in it, but there's also not much plot from Tolkien. Remember, there's only a handful of pages that they've got the rights to. Tolkien wrote thousands of pages, but only the rights to The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings have been sold. They managed to negotiate a little bit more in terms of getting a map of Numenor and so forth, but they're only dealing with just a few pages and hints, and the rest of it is just filled out. Now, if you're a Tolkien purist, you won't accept that. You'll say that this just should have been, in that case, like a 90-minute made-for-TV film. But they wanted to turn it into a multi-season blockbuster, allegedly the most expensive TV series ever made. So it will be different. But I think that it does, try to build upon the characteristics and the qualities of Peter Jackson and indeed Tolkien's book. So you do have some humour from the Harfoots, for example. I'd say there's. I'm not going to offer any spoilers. So that's Sadok Burrows. And he's another British comedian, Sir Lenny Henry. There's also a bit of humour from the dwarves there, but in the main, the characters lack the sort of the frivolity that they do in The Hobbit. You also get a series of very strong women, such as Bronwen and Queen Miriel, and of course Galadriel. Now there are strong women in the Jackson movies, such as Galadriel, Arwen and Éowyn. There's also Toriel in The Hobbit, and in The Rings of Power there's Nori, who's another strong female Harfoot or Hobbit. But there's clearly a decision to present strong women and a racial diversity among the different species in The Rings of Power, which I think makes it quite different from something like Game of Thrones. I see Game of Thrones as very much a pre-COVID, amoral, rather than like brutal, highly sexualized, the sex is sort of weaponized in Game of Thrones. Whereas The Rings of Power seems to be post-COVID. It's much more to do with cooperation, consolation. Not at the beginning. They're all very isolationist and separate. But it's about the perils of isolationism and about the importance of maybe working together, even though the ultimate sort of conclusion of this would be the Third Age and the Lord of the Rings. It's also, I think, as becomes aware as you watch the first season, the characters are deeply flawed, and this is the most exciting thing about this series, I think, is that Galadriel starts off as a sort of a shield maiden, this sort of fantastic warrior, leader of the northern armies. But she becomes sort of increasingly difficult, an increasingly interesting and complex character because of that. So the showmakers of The Rings of Power are taking inspiration from the way that Peter Jackson made Galadriel a powerful figure, but also thinking that with that power comes character flaws and difficulties as well. Now, this is one of the reasons why Tolkien purists find it so difficult to deal with, because this isn't the Galadriel that they're familiar with from the published works. But I'll just say something about the level of detail which you get, for example, in Numenor. The entire set is a physical set. It's built. It's not CGI'd. They developed their own Numenorian alphabet for graffiti on the walls. And they even, because it's a port, they even had people off-screen frying fish so the actors would be reminded of the seaside and the coastal atmosphere while they were performing. So you get those sort of hints. There's intangible hints that are supposed to carry through onto the actual screen. But to say, Tolkien purists have really attacked it and attacked me. I made the terrible mistake of doing a podcast and saying, they asked me about Rings of Power, and I said, well, I think it's very interesting, and you've got to see it in the context of the other adaptations. I'm writing about it in the new edition. They said, you've just got to give it a chance. We've only had the first season. Straight away, an avalanche of complaint. Why should we give it a chance? So I think the reason, what we're dealing with here, we're not just dealing with one Tolkien. There are many Tolkiens. There's a Tolkien who lived until 50 years ago this year. He died in 1973. He didn't publish much about Middle-earth. He published The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And then he said other things in letters and in interviews, sometimes years later. Those weren't published until the 1980s. So that's one Tolkien. You've then got this Tolkien literary industry that's grown up since then. Volumes and volumes and volumes of the history of Middle-earth, of different versions of Beren and Luthien, the fall of Gondolin, and so forth. More books of notes. The Numenor book came out last year to coincide with the Rings of Power. So there are about 20 volumes of extra material. So the Tolkien purists will delve into this and find all sorts of reasons to disagree with the Rings of Power, or indeed Peter Jackson, or indeed with me. But I'm sort of hoping to reach out to a more common reader rather than a specialist who knows Elvish backwards. But then, there are the films, the adaptations. There are many other film versions. There's a Finnish one. There's a Russian one. For example, there are other radio adaptations. There's an American adaptation. There's a BBC adaptation of The Hobbit and so forth. So what we're dealing with is a really multi-platform Tolkien here, as I suggested at the beginning. And then this has got a whole new level. Sorry, this has gone again. Thank you. With all the merchandise. So Tolkien's been sort of profoundly monetized with all the souvenirs, the props you can get, including the ring, which I'm wearing, although you can see me. So you clearly have powers beyond your ken here. But I think that's really the point on which it's worth bearing in mind, that we can't just take one Tolkien out of this, I think. You need to, if you're approaching a writer as complex as Tolkien, it's a phenomenon now. It's an industry. It's a whole sort of it's a whole area of cultural activity. And just to focus on one particular area, I think means that you're not really able to meet other readers or film viewers or listeners or game players who might enjoy the same world of Middle-earth. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. I hope I've left some time for some questions here now, so thank you. Are there any questions?
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. And I have a few questions, but I won't take all the time, so I just maybe we'll make one by one. Okay, so the first one is, because you made such deep research on the subject, I would like to ask you, as a Portuguese person, if the Hobbit, the character of Frodo, was inspired in a Portuguese person, because that's what we have in Portuguese as a kind of a myth, because of being very short and hairy and having like 5 meals a day or more, and yeah, so everyone has this kind of myth that it was inspired by a Portuguese person. Do you know anything about this?
That's the best question I've ever had. Thank you. I think it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, Tolkien called himself a hobbit, but he wasn't Portuguese. He describes Warwickshire as being the heart of England, and that's where the Shire would be, or maybe it's Oxfordshire. He's never quite sure about things like this. I think it's also inspired by Cornwall, where he went on holiday several times, and where arguably the people there are short and very nimble with their fingers and enjoy many meals. But what you've really hit upon is the way that different regions, cultures, countries, languages can find something to identify with. And the book hasn't yet been written because it would take many people to participate in it, but to actually look at exactly what you suggested, to see how Tolkien has been received, whether in Portugal or in Russia. This book's being translated into Russian. There's a Russian film version of The Lord of the Rings. Or in all sorts of places, in India, for example. Not to mention in China and Hong Kong and, of course, Macau. Because when I first taught the course in Macau, I was amazed at the number of students who were all very familiar with the posthumous publication of things like the history of Middle-earth. So there's a real sort of awareness and expertise in that, I think. So it'd be fascinating to find out, how people are making those connections and what cultural myths there might be around on. So yes, in a sense, and this is to perhaps vaingloriously connect Tolkien with another writer, but not for an age, but for all time, not for one place, but for everywhere. But you're quite right that we all find different ways of connecting with them. But thank you, lovely question. Thank you. Have you got one there that works?
You said about a lot of ambiguity. Sorry, I should thank you first. Thank you for your presentation. It's just fantastic. Sorry. You said a lot about ambiguity in describing the Hobbit as a character, because he's not those kind of didactician character to teach a moral education to readers. Is it a reference to the 19th century modernism, like Henry James' The Turn of Screw, or Alan Poe's novel that doesn't have any intentions to write? So do you think that Tolkien considered that complexity and ambiguity as a part of human nature, so he doesn't want to fix any kind of impressions on his characters?
That's really helpful, thank you. I think he's certainly drawing on some 19th century traditions in terms of the character of Bilbo. But I also think he's drawing on much more recent characterizations, such as a series of stories called the Just William stories, which is basically about a very naughty schoolchild who leads a gang. He's always getting into scrapes, always making mischief. And there's an element, there's absolutely no morality, there's no didacticism. This isn't trying to teach children how to behave, it's just teaching them to have fun by disobeying adults. And there's sort of quality. Now, Bilbo's grown up, remember, he's a well-to-do hobbit. But he doesn't think twice about lying or about stealing or about dealing with things like the Arkenstone. And I really wanted to sort of think about how that fits into this sort of bigger picture. And it goes beyond children's literature. It goes, as you suggest, into modernism, I think, and these elements of uncertainty and ambiguity. Tolkien's not a full-blooded modernist writer, but he's got definite affinities with those writers. He did read James Joyce, not just Ulysses. He read Finnegan's Wake and made notes on it. And I think that he didn't think that Joyce had gone far enough. Because Tolkien is dealing with different languages and multiplicity of languages. He's making up words and things like that. So he'd enjoy that experimental aspect of it. But he also wanted to distance himself from what he saw as a sort of trendy modernism. So he sort of he brings in the Anglo-Saxon, for example, and those sorts of sources. But in terms of the development of Bilbo, in a sense, he does go on a journey. But it's also a circular journey, because The Hobbit was written as a self-contained book, and at the end he just gets home. And yes, there's a bit of a disaster. Everything's being sold, but there is closure, and it's only when he's asked to write a sequel that he opens up the story again, and then has to rewrite parts of The Hobbit. I don't know if people realise this, but things like the riddle game with Gollum. Originally, Gollum had willingly wanted to give Bilbo the ring willingly, and the Bilbo already had it in his pocket. He had found it. And Gollum gets upset because he can't give him the ring. Now, of course, he had to completely rewrite that passage. But again, it shows Bilbo as being very sort of like morally dubious. He's found something. He doesn't tell the person who's lost it that he's got it. He wants to have another reward for winning the riddle game, which should be shown the way out. And also, the last riddle that he asked isn't a riddle at all. It's what have I got in my pocket? But then Gollum makes a mistake of saying, ask me a question. So it's quite subtle. You know, I think that there is this, you know, they're playing a riddle game, but then Gollum says the wrong thing. He says, ask me a question. And that's Bilbo's get out of jail free card. That's his sort of get out clause, really. All of a sudden, he sees a route out of it. And that route is always, in the case of Bilbo, practical. You know, Tolkien was he was a Tridentine Catholic, took his faith very seriously, but he wanted to see how things worked on the ground, how you lived a life day to day, and, you know, managed to, you know, get by, really. So that's the secret of it. But thank you. Thank you for a very good question.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Thank you. I wanted to know your opinion on Feanor. As we know, for a few years, his reputation has been getting a little bit better than before, because before, I think, throughout the years, everybody saw him very in a black or white kind of character. But nowadays, people are seeing Feanor as an anti-hero. And of course, he wasn't featured in the Rings of Power openly, let's say. What is your opinion on this character? Do you think the fact that people change their view on this character, or are changing, is a sign of the times, or how do you look at it?
That's a really nice way of suggesting it's a sign of the times. So for those who aren't familiar with the Silmarillion or with the history of Middle-earth, Feanor was the greatest elvish craftsman of all, who makes the Silmarils, who are these extraordinary gems which then caused the War of the Silmarils and eventually the downfall of the elvish kingdoms and the rupturing of the earth. I think you're probably right. I think, yes, changing attitudes towards notions of leadership and heroism, and also anti-authoritarianism, I think, would suggest that Feanor becomes more attractive. Also, there's been way more published. You know, in mid-1970s, Christopher Tolkien and Hugh Guy Gavray produced the Silmarillion as a single volume, but now there's been volumes and volumes and volumes developing those characters. One of the things that in the first published Silmarillion, which they didn't include, was the fact that Tolkien was making Galadriel a much more important character. That when he's writing Lord of the Rings, he realizes that Galadriel is one of the key characters, so he goes back to the mythology to rewrite parts of that, and Galadriel becomes more and more important. But that doesn't get into the first published version. So I think, you know, many of these characters are not stable because we have so many different versions of them. I think Feanor is probably an example of that. But he can, I think, become a sort of an anti-hero champion. I think you're quite right. And I think to sort of see that in the context of recent political shifts would be very, very fruitful. Thank you.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Thank you for your lecture. It's really impressive. And here's my question. You have said that when Tolkien writes The Lord of the Rings, he first had no plan for it. It's just about randomly the story came itself. But we all know that for this whole world, the Middle Earth, Tolkien, he actually creates a whole real world. It's very sensible. It has the whole map and even a whole language system. So I wonder, how can he achieve this world without a plan?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, because as you suggest, for years and years and years, since he'd been convalescing during the First World War, he'd been working on this sort of grand invented mythology, which were the tales of the Silmarillion, but they only cover the first and second ages of Middle-earth, and everything in the Lord of the Rings takes place thousands of years later, in the Third Age. So the Silmarillion doesn't include hobbits. That's why Treebeard doesn't know what they are. You know, Treebeard's knowledge is dated. Everybody thinks that the Ents know everything, particularly Treebeard. He's such a lovely, huggable character. You know, he's very trustworthy. Well, no, he's not. He doesn't know what hobbits are, so he's missing a major aspect. He also lets Saruman go. And what does that lead to? The scouring of the Shire. So he makes a series of mistakes. And Tolkien, I think, is keen for us to recognise them. But he has this fantastic sort of body or sort of kitty of stories and languages and characters and earlier events. And you can use that as a backdrop to create this impression of a long history. But because the events of the Lord of the Rings are many thousands of years later, they don't really impinge very much on them, apart from characters like Elrond and Galadriel, I think. So there is even after 20 years of him writing and working on the Silmarillion, he's quite happy to start changing it. He changes it, first of all, with The Hobbit, because he realises that dwarves aren't necessarily evil characters. Then he changes it with Lord of the Rings when he realises that the ring, the significance of the ring, and therefore Sauron, that Sauron continues to have power, and therefore the significance of hobbits. So he's not treating his own creation as something which is stable and solid and inflexible. He's always prepared to actually rework it. And that's one of the reasons why he never finished it.
Hi, Professor. Thanks
Hello,
for
nice
the
to
great
see you
talk. I wanted to ask you about, obviously, Tolkien had a deep experience with war, taking part in the First World War. And I wanted to ask, how did this experience influence his work, and what kind of views he imparted on his books about war?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and if I'd have had another few minutes, I'd have said more about that, because I mean, his whole life was deeply coloured by the experience of war, by the direct experience of war. He was at the Somme. He was then invalided out with trench fever, and then he's writing The Lord of the Rings during the Second World War, when two of his sons are fighting, and when he's also himself an air raid warden. So there's a constant awareness of that, and I think it permeates particularly The Lord of the Rings, in the sense of, this is war writing. That's one of the reasons why there are so few female characters, because for Europeans at the front, you didn't see women there. You get one or two of the more sort of warrior women characters, but that's why there's an emphasis on things like sentry duty, and on rations, on sort of supplies, on organisation. When Pippin goes to Minas Tirith, for example, this is a city under siege. It's all very well structured. The fact that Tolkien doesn't have single individual characters, hardly ever in his writing. He normally has small groups. They're like little units. There are 2 or 3, or of course 9 in the case of the Company of the Ring. Even calling it the Company of the Ring, that's a military term. I think he's sort of playing with those sorts of ways of thinking about the world. Now, he was very resistant that the book should be seen as an allegory of the war or of atomic power or of anything at all. I think he's quite right to say that. But it clearly bears the deep impression of those experiences and those privations, I think, and those losses as well. Because at the end, the book is about failure and death. He lost many of his friends during the First World War. Then he saw the ravages of the Second World War and the aftermath of that. So I think that the whole tone of the book is really affected by that sense of defeat. Because although the Allies ostensibly win, what do they discover at the end? They discover the Holocaust and the devastation of the atomic weaponry. So it's a very hollow victory, I think. Thank you.
Excuse me, Professor. I would like to ask, thank you for presenting this lecture, and I want to know, ever since these past few decades of Tolkien writing his Legendarium, was it written as a way of telling the English mythology, as we assume that it doesn't have one?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you very much indeed for that. He dedicated his stories to England, and he felt that England had a complex mythology but had lost it, in main down to the Norman invasion of 1066, but also consequence of the Reformation, when many cathedral and ecclesiastical libraries were destroyed. So that's what he says, but you've got to be very suspicious about what he says. It's certainly got English elements in it, but as we've sort of heard, it also appeals to nations and cultures across the world. So I think it does start off as having its roots, or maybe the seeds are planted in an English soil, which is why he draws on Anglo-Saxon, for example, and on Beowulf. But I think it turns into something which is of itself. And England is changing so much when he's writing, with the First World War, with the Depression, with the Second World War, that it's all gone. That's why when they get back from the war, it's not the Shire's been saved, says Frodo, but not for me. You can't go back. It's a really bitter lesson to learn. But the sort of sense of, we were just talking about, the sense of victory isn't felt, it doesn't manifest. Frodo has alienated himself from his friends, from the Shire, from Middle-earth. He can't live there anymore. So there is that sort of sense of, real sort of dark sense, I think. So if that's the English national mythology, then so be it. But I think it becomes something of itself, which reflects the changing nature of European society and culture, really. And England is certainly part of that. But it goes way beyond England. He's fascinated in Welsh, in Finnish, in Scandinavia, and so forth. But it's a really good starting point. Thank you very much indeed for that. That's great. Thank you. I guess we should probably finish there, because I see there's crowds arriving for the next panel. So I'll just.